The dust storm that swept across several cities.
Tonight, America is under siege from every direction. Wildfires are swallowing Georgia, Florida, and Maine as entire neighborhoods vanish beneath walls of flame. At the exact same moment, massive snowstorms are burying the Rockies under nearly 30 inches of snow in May. The Colorado River is drying up, exposing ancient structures hidden beneath the water for generations. A massive bridge collapses without warning. Healthy forests in California are dying overnight. The sky is turning colors no one can explain above violent tornadoes in Texas and Oklahoma. And deep-sea creatures that belong in the abyss are washing ashore alive. One disaster is news. Two is a coincidence. But all of this at the same time is something else entirely. The first flames appeared just after sunset across the southeastern United States. Small orange points of light scattered across the dry grasslands of Georgia. At a distance, they looked almost harmless, like controlled burns on farmland or distant lights from passing trucks on rural highways. But these lights were spreading. By morning, over 700 separate fires had erupted across Georgia alone. Smoke columns rose into the sky from multiple locations simultaneously. What had started as isolated brush fires were consuming everything in their path far faster than anyone anticipated. The same drought conditions that had dried riverbeds and turned forests into kindling had also stripped the soil of any moisture that might have slowed the advance. Grasslands that once held life became explosive fuel. Trees lining sections of the countryside appeared gray and brittle beneath layers of heat stress, left by months without rain. When the flames reached them, they didn't just burn, they erupted. Residents described waking up to the smell of burning air before even seeing flames. The smoke carried on winds moving aggressively through the region, spreading the scent of destruction across areas miles from the actual fire lines. Videos circulating online showed roads disappearing behind thick smoke while families fled with whatever they could grab in minutes. "I've lived here my whole life," one Georgia resident said, standing in her driveway as ash fell around her like gray snow. "I've never seen anything like this. The fire just came so fast. We didn't have time to think." Emergency crews rushed between outbreak points, but the fires seemed to be starting everywhere at once. Not from a single source spreading outward. Multiple ignition points across different counties, all flaring to life within the same time period. By the time containment efforts began in earnest, more than 1.9 million acres had already burned across the United States, and the most dangerous summer heat had not yet arrived. But Georgia was not alone. While families in the southeast watched flames move toward homes they had spent decades building, another nightmare was unfolding hundreds of miles to the south. Florida began to burn. In the Everglades, flames tore through tens of thousands of acres, moving faster than emergency models had predicted. Thick smoke rolled upward in heavy columns, turning daylight into a dim orange haze. Highways were shut down, visibility vanished to near zero. Families packed what they could and left under skies that looked more like sunset than afternoon. The landscape glowed red, not from reflection but from active fire pushing through dry brush and wind-fed grasslands. What made the Florida fires uniquely terrifying was the terrain itself. The Everglades by nature is an ecosystem where fire plays a recurring role. But not like this. Not with this speed, not with this intensity. Months of drought had left vegetation brittle and highly flammable. Strong winds accelerated the spread far beyond containment lines. Lightning strikes provided the initial spark in multiple locations. From a scientific perspective, the conditions had created a massive fire hazard waiting for ignition. But what unsettled many observers wasn't the fires themselves, it was the columns of smoke. They rose steadily into the Florida sky. Not thin wisps, but thick towering plumes that could be seen for miles. From a distance, they stood upright against the horizon, dark and defined, unmoving as winds shifted around them. Residents who stopped to photograph the scene said the smoke pillars looked almost deliberate. Not chaotic, not scattered, but standing like monuments above the burning land. For many believers watching these images spread across social media, the visual was inescapable. Joel chapter 2 verse 30 speaks of blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The verse is ancient, rooted in prophetic imagery, describing moments when heaven and earth seemed to echo one another. No one claimed the Everglades fire was supernatural. It had fuel, it had wind, it had heat. But symbolism does not require the suspension of science. Sometimes meaning grows from resemblance. Fire on the ground, red light in the sky, smoke rising in pillars. And then the flames reached Maine. This was the detail that caused many Americans to pause. Maine, a region once considered largely safe from large-scale fire disasters. A place known for cold winters, dense forests, and moderate summers, not a fire zone. Not a place where evacuation orders were common. Yet there it was, burning. Forests that had stood green for generations were suddenly turning into walls of flame. Communities that had never prepared for wildfire were forced to confront it without warning. The fire did not care about history or expectation. It only needed fuel, and the land provided it. What made this psychologically devastating was the violation of safety. Places once viewed as secure now felt vulnerable. The mental maps Americans had drawn, fire zones here, safe zones there, no longer applied. The old boundaries had failed. One resident in Maine described standing outside with a garden hose, watching flames move closer to a home that had been in his family for 4 generations. "You think you know your land," he said. "You think you understand the risks. And then one afternoon, everything you thought you knew just doesn't matter anymore." Across the country, the same pattern repeated. Fires where they shouldn't be. Speed that shouldn't be possible. Intensity that overwhelmed systems designed for calmer, more predictable conditions. And as ash fell across 3 states like snow from a sky that had turned orange, many Americans began asking the same question. Is this just a bad fire season? Or is something deeper happening to the land itself? Fire officials pointed toward the perfect storm of environmental conditions. Extended drought had reduced vegetation moisture to critical levels across multiple regions. Strong winds provided rapid flame spread beyond what models predicted. Changing weather patterns had created conditions no one had prepared for. The science was sound. The explanations were reasonable. But what unsettled many observers wasn't the fires themselves. It was the sequence. First, the drought had weakened the land over months, stripping moisture from soil and vegetation alike. Then the winds came, not gently but with force, pushing flames faster than crews could respond. And now fire was exploiting every vulnerability created by earlier events, consuming landscapes that had no defense left. Each event individually made sense. Together, they formed a pattern that felt disturbingly familiar to anyone who had read certain passages of Scripture. The prophet Joel described exactly this progression. A fire devoureth before them, and behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Joel chapter 2, verse 3. For generations, verses like that belong to sermons about ancient times or distant prophecy. But watching smoke rise from scorched hills beneath darkened skies across Georgia, Florida, and Maine, the language no longer felt historical. It felt like real-time reporting. What made the fires psychologically devastating was how they interacted with everything else happening simultaneously. The drought had weakened the land, heat had stressed the vegetation, and now fire was taking everything that remained. One emergency worker in Georgia reportedly said, "It's like the land itself is giving up. The fires burned for days." Some sections were contained quickly. Others continued spreading despite constant aerial water drops and ground crew efforts. At night, residents could see glowing lines of flame moving across dark hillsides like slowly advancing armies. The combination of smoke, ash, and continuing atmospheric instability created air quality problems across multiple states. Schools and businesses advised people to remain indoors when possible. Medical facilities reported increased respiratory complaints. But even as firefighting efforts continued across the Southeast, another crisis was already unfolding thousands of miles away. Because while America's southern states burned beneath orange skies and choking smoke, the Rocky Mountains were about to be buried alive. Not by fire, by snow, nearly 30 inches of it in the middle of May. And the sudden shift from flame to ice would leave even skeptics questioning whether the seasons themselves had become confused. While wildfires continued spreading across the South, another extreme was unfolding high in the Rocky Mountains. Powerful late-season snowstorms suddenly swept across Colorado, Wyoming, and parts of the Rockies, burying entire regions beneath nearly 30 inches of snow. In the middle of May, roads vanished overnight under thick snowdrifts as winter conditions returned, at a time when warmer spring weather should already dominate the mountains. Residents described waking up in disbelief as heavy snow-covered vehicles, homes, and highways that only days earlier had been clear and dry. "I looked out my window and just stood there," one Colorado resident said. "2 days ago I was planting flowers. Now there's 3 feet of snow against my door." The sudden shift felt unnatural. Not simply unexpected weather, but something more fundamental. As if the seasons themselves had become confused. In one part of the country, forests were burning beneath orange skies and choking smoke. In another, blizzard-like conditions were shutting down roads and covering entire landscapes in ice and snow. Fire and ice, heat and freezing cold, unfolding across the same nation at the exact same time. Meteorologists explained these events through unstable weather patterns, shifting jet streams, and dramatic temperature contrasts across the United States. The science was sound. Cold air from the north had collided with warm air from the south, creating conditions ripe for late-season snowfall in higher elevations. But even with those explanations, many people said the growing extremes felt increasingly difficult to ignore. What made the Rockies snowstorm especially unsettling was its timing and intensity. Late-season snow is not unusual in the mountains, but nearly 30 inches in a single system during mid-May fell far outside typical patterns. Highways were closed for days, communities were temporarily cut off, vehicles were abandoned on roads that became impassable within hours. Residents who had lived in the region for decades said they had never seen anything like it. Snow in May happens, one Wyoming rancher explained, but not like this, not this much, not this fast. The weight of the snow caused roofs to collapse in several communities. Power lines snapped under the accumulating ice, plunging neighborhoods into darkness while temperatures continued to drop. Families that had switched from heating to cooling just weeks earlier were suddenly scrambling to stay warm. At the same time, in the southeast, families were fleeing flames. The contrast was impossible to ignore. America now appeared caught between opposite forces happening simultaneously. Fire in one region, snowstorms in another, heat and freezing cold unfolding together across the same nation. Social media filled with images showing the split-screen reality. On one side, orange skies and walls of flame advancing through Georgia forests. On the other, whiteout conditions and snow-covered highways in Colorado. The same country, the same week, the same moment in history. For many believers, these moments led them back to Scripture in a way that felt urgent rather than academic. Romans chapter 8, verse 22 says, "For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now." The verse describes a world under pressure, a creation itself reacting and straining, not passively existing, but actively responding to something deeper than weather patterns. The language of groaning implies more than mechanical function. It suggests distress, something involuntary, a system under stress that cannot remain silent. And as disasters continued spreading across the land in unexpected ways, many Christians began asking whether these were simply unusual weather events or signs that the world was entering a season of growing instability unlike anything seen before. What made this moment feel different was the simultaneity. America had experienced wildfires before. It had experienced late-season snowstorms before. But the two extremes had rarely converged with such intensity at the same time across the same nation. It felt less like separate events and more like one event manifesting in different ways. Emergency management systems in multiple states were stretched to their limits. Resources that would normally be shared between regions were unavailable because every region needed them simultaneously. Colorado couldn't send help to Georgia because Colorado was buried under snow. Georgia couldn't send help to Florida because Georgia was on fire. The system was designed for sequential crises, one disaster at a time. This was something different. Meteorologists continued pointing to climate patterns, shifting weather systems, and atmospheric pressure anomalies. They emphasized that extreme events, while unusual, were not inexplicable. The explanations existed. The mechanisms were understood. But what the explanations could not address was the feeling spreading across the country. The feeling that something had shifted. Residents in affected areas described it in similar terms despite living thousands of miles apart. A sense that the natural order had become unreliable. That the rhythms they had trusted, spring planting, summer heat, fall harvest, winter cold, no longer held. The seasons were still turning, but they were turning wrong. A farmer in Wyoming stood beside his snow-covered truck and said, "I've worked this land for 40 years. The seasons had a rhythm. You could count on it. Now I don't know what to count on anymore." That sentiment echoed across regions and generations. Something foundational felt different, and the unease was not limited to those who studied Scripture. Even secular observers acknowledged that the frequency and intensity of extremes seemed to be accelerating. But the snow in the Rockies was not the end of the pattern. It was only the next piece. Because while parts of America burned, and others froze beneath late-season snow, something even stranger was happening beneath the water itself. Along the Colorado River and Lake Mead, water levels continued dropping to historic lows, and what the receding waters revealed would send a shock through communities already on edge. Structures began to emerge from beneath the surface. ancient-looking stone foundations, aligned formations, patterns that looked intentional rather than natural. Things that had been hidden beneath the water for generations were suddenly exposed to open air. And as drone footage of these discoveries spread across social media, the question became unavoidable. If the land is burning, the seasons are confused, and now hidden things are being revealed. What else is about to surface? While parts of America burned and others froze beneath late-season snow, something even stranger was happening beneath the water itself. Along the Colorado River and Lake Mead, water levels continued dropping to historic lows, exposing ancient-looking stone foundations hidden beneath mud for generations. What had been concealed was suddenly visible. What had been buried was now revealed. Witnesses described standing along the dried shoreline in silence, saying it felt like the past was suddenly being uncovered. Some formations appeared intentionally aligned, resembling walls, pathways, and forgotten structures buried long ago beneath the water. Drone footage spreading online only increased the mystery. The images showed shapes that did not look random, lines that met at right angles, stones arranged in patterns that suggested purpose rather than accident. One man who had fished Lake Mead for 30 years stood at the edge of the receding water and said, "I've been coming here my whole life. I thought I knew every inch of this lake. Now it looks like a different place, like something was hiding under us the whole time." What made the discoveries especially unsettling was their timing. For decades, these structures had remained invisible, covered by water deep enough to conceal them completely. Entire generations had boated, fished, and swum above them without ever knowing what lay beneath. Then, within the same narrow window of time that brought wildfires to the southeast, snowstorms to the Rockies, and extreme weather across the nation, the waters began pulling back, and the hidden things began to appear. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, had reached its lowest levels since the 1930s when it was first filled. The bathtub ring, the white mineral deposit along the shoreline, marking where water once sat, had grown so tall that it was visible from satellite images. Boat ramps that once served busy marinas now ended in dry dirt hundreds of feet from the water's edge. Bodies were found, sunken boats lost equipment, items dropped overboard decades ago and forgotten. But what captured national attention were the structures. Stone formations that appeared too regular to be natural, foundations that suggested buildings rather than geology, alignments that pointed in directions that seemed deliberate. Archaeologists cautioned against jumping to conclusions. Natural rock formations can sometimes appear man-made. Erosion can create patterns that mimic human construction. More study was needed before definitive claims could be made, but the images had already spread. And for millions of Americans watching from their homes, the scientific caution did little to ease the growing sense that something unusual was unfolding. What made the discoveries along Lake Mead and the Colorado River resonate so deeply was not just the structures themselves, but what they represented. Things that had been hidden were now being exposed, not through excavation or intentional exploration, but through the land itself releasing what it had covered. The drought had not arrived with noise or violence. It had arrived quietly, slowly, year after year of below-average rainfall, snowpack that failed to materialize, reservoirs that dropped inch by inch, then foot by foot, until the bottom began to show. And when the bottom showed, it revealed secrets. For many believers, these discoveries immediately brought Scripture to mind. Luke chapter 8, verse 17 says, "For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad." Throughout the Bible, hidden things were often revealed during moments of warning and change. Not randomly, not accidentally, but as part of a larger pattern where what was concealed could no longer remain buried. The verse speaks broadly, not merely of objects, but of revelation itself. Truth surfacing. What was done in darkness coming into light. And while no one could say with certainty that the Lake Mead structures were directly connected to biblical prophecy, the symbolism was difficult to ignore. Something that had been hidden was now visible. Something that had been buried was now exposed. And it had happened during a season already marked by fire, snow, and growing instability across the land. The Colorado River itself told a similar story. The river that supplied water to 40 million people across 7 states was shrinking. Its flow had decreased by 20% over the past century. Its reservoirs had dropped to crisis levels. The water that once seemed endless was proving to be finite. And as the water receded, more than structures emerged. Petroglyphs appeared on rocks that had been submerged for decades. Ancient carvings left by people who had lived along the river long before the reservoirs were built. Messages from the past that had been drowned by the present were suddenly visible again. What's down there that we haven't seen yet? one visitor asked, standing on the cracked mud of a former lake bottom. What else has been hiding under the water? The question echoed across the country. Because the drying rivers were not the only places where hidden things were coming to light. Sinkholes were opening across Florida, California, and Texas, swallowing roads and threatening homes without warning. Not caused by earthquakes or storms, simply appearing. The ground giving way to cavities that had formed silently over years, finally collapsing when the surface could no longer hold. In each case, the pattern repeated. Something hidden beneath the surface. Something that had been forming in darkness. Something that finally broke through when the pressure became too great. The land itself seemed to be revealing what it had concealed. For many believers, these events pointed toward a deeper spiritual reality. Throughout Scripture, moments of judgment were often preceded by revelation. What was hidden came to light before consequences followed. Truth surfaced before the verdict arrived. And now, across America, hidden things were surfacing everywhere. The question was no longer whether something unusual was happening. The question was what it meant, and what else was about to be revealed. Because while the rivers continued drying and the ground continued opening, reports were already emerging from the coasts that would make the discoveries along Lake Mead look like the beginning rather than the end. Deep-sea creatures were about to appear where they did not belong, and they were not arriving dead. They were arriving alive. What is happening on land does not stop at the shoreline. Along the coast of the United States, reports began emerging of deep-sea creatures washing ashore, alive, uninjured, and far from where they were meant to exist. These are not species that wander near beaches or shallow waters by accident. They are creatures built for darkness, for crushing pressure, for isolation thousands of feet below the surface. They belong to a world humans rarely see, a world of silence, cold, and concealment. Yet now, they were appearing in places where sunlight touches the water and human eyes can see them clearly. Among them were oarfish, often called the doomsday fish by coastal communities. Long ribbon-like bodies with metallic silver scales and bright red dorsal fins running the entire length of their spines. They can grow to over 30 feet. They swim vertically in the deep ocean, and they are almost never seen alive near the surface. But they were appearing. Not one, not two. Multiple oarfish washed ashore along different coastlines within the same narrow window of time, each one alive when it arrived, each one far from the depths where it belonged. Fishermen, who had spent their lives on the water, said they had never seen anything like it. Some had heard stories from their grandfathers, legends about oarfish appearing before earthquakes or disasters. But those were stories, folklore, not something you expected to witness with your own eyes. I've been fishing these waters for 42 years, one California fisherman said, standing on the beach beside the long silver body of an oarfish that had washed up overnight. I've seen strange things, but I've never seen one of these alive. They don't belong here. They belong in the deep, in the dark. Something made them leave. What made these events even more unsettling was the silence surrounding them. There were no storms driving these animals toward land. No underwater earthquakes detected at the time of many sightings. No visible injuries suggesting panic, pursuit, or trauma. The sea in these moments appeared calm on the surface, even as it released what it had long concealed. Other deep-water species followed. Lanternfish with their bioluminescent bodies, normally found thousands of feet below. Giant squid remains rarely seen intact. Unusual jellyfish species that scientists struggled to identify. Each appearance adding to the growing sense that something below was changing. The oarfish quickly became the symbol of the phenomenon. In Japanese folklore, the oarfish is known as Rugu no Tsukai, the messenger from the sea god's palace. According to tradition, these creatures rise to the surface and beach themselves when significant seismic activity is approaching. They are not seen as accidents, they are seen as warnings. For decades, marine biologists had dismissed this connection as superstition, and yet the correlation persisted in the data. Before major earthquakes in Japan, Chile, and other regions, oarfish sightings had increased. The science remained inconclusive. The timing remained difficult to dismiss. Now they were appearing along American coastlines. Scientists continued searching for explanations. Some suggested subtle temperature shifts or changes in ocean currents that might disorient deep water species. Others pointed to disturbances deep below the seabed, pressure changes, gas releases, or seismic activity too subtle for surface detection. Certain researchers noted that species like oarfish and other deep-dwelling creatures are rarely observed alive near the surface, and their sudden appearance raised questions about unseen changes occurring in the abyss. But even among experts, the timing remained difficult to explain. These events were not scattered across decades. They were clustered closely together, unfolding within the same narrow window as the fires, the snowstorms, and the drying rivers. They were following a pattern rather than coincidence. What disturbed many observers most was not simply the creatures themselves, but what they represented. The deep ocean is the most alien environment on Earth. It is a place of mystery, pressure, and darkness. It is where things are hidden, where they are kept, where they remain out of sight. And now it was giving up what it held. In Scripture, the sea is rarely just water. It represents depth, mystery, and the unknown. It is the place where things are hidden, restrained, and kept out of sight. When the Bible speaks of the sea giving up what it holds, it is often describing a moment of revelation, when what was concealed can no longer remain buried. Revelation chapter 20, verse 13 says, "And the sea gave up the dead which were in it." The verse describes a moment of ultimate reckoning, a time when nothing remains hidden, when even the deepest places release what they have held. No one was claiming the oarfish and lanternfish washing ashore were a direct fulfillment of that verse. But the imagery was impossible to ignore. The sea was releasing what it had long concealed, and it was doing so during a season already marked by fire on the land, confusion in the seasons, and hidden structures emerging from drying rivers. These moments are not always violent. Sometimes they arrive quietly, almost gently, carrying weight without noise. That is what made these sightings so disturbing. There was no chaos, no dramatic upheaval, just the steady surf, and something ancient and unfamiliar resting where it did not belong. One beachgoer in Southern California described the moment she saw an oarfish still moving in the shallow water. At first, I thought it was a piece of metal or debris. Then it moved, this long silver body just gliding through the water. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. Something felt wrong. That feeling, something felt wrong, echoed across the country. Creatures believed to inhabit the deepest regions of the ocean now lay its exposed at the boundary between the known and the unknown. It felt less like an accident and more like a signal, as if boundaries that once held firm were beginning to loosen. Revelation in the biblical sense does not begin with destruction. It begins with exposure. Truth surfaces before judgment arrives. What is hidden comes into view before consequences follow. The sea, by releasing these creatures, seemed to echo that pattern. If the ocean was revealing what it once concealed, the question became unavoidable. What else may be rising next? And are we prepared to understand what it means? Because even as the oarfish and lanternfish washed ashore along the Pacific coast, something far more terrifying was already stirring beneath the Atlantic. A creature no one could identify, moving with purpose, rising from depths no camera should have been able to capture. And when the footage surfaced online, even marine biologists had no answer for what they were seeing. Even before the oarfish began washing ashore, something else had already appeared off the coast. A creature no one could identify, moving with purpose, rising from depths that should have kept it hidden forever. The first reports came from fishermen working the waters off the Atlantic coast. They described a shape beneath the surface that did not match any whale, shark, or known marine species. Something long, sleek, moving with a control that seemed intentional rather than instinctual. It didn't move like a fish, one fisherman said later, his voice still carrying disbelief. It moved like it was thinking, like it knew exactly where it was going. The creature rose from below with a speed and control that seemed almost intelligent. One deckhand described it as a shadow with purpose, slicing through the water as if following a precise line drawn beneath the waves. When the creature passed close enough for someone to capture a brief, shaky clip on a phone, its features stunned everyone who later analyzed the footage. Its body was long, unnaturally long, sleek and powerful, covered in metallic blue skin that reflected light like polished stone. Along its back ran a defined ridge of dorsal spikes, sharp and evenly spaced, creating a silhouette no marine biologist could match to any catalog species known in American waters. Not a whale, not a shark, not an eel, and not any deep-sea creature previously recorded. The way it moved was equally unsettling. Most large sea animals flex their bodies in wide arcs when swimming. Whales arch, sharks undulate, eels wriggle. This creature did none of those things. It sliced forward with rigid control, twisting only when it needed to change direction. The movement was efficient, precise, almost mechanical. "Oh my God," someone whispered on the recording. "What is that?" The footage spread quickly. Within days, it had been viewed millions of times. Marine biologists were contacted. Experts were interviewed. Theories were offered. Some suggested it might be a giant oarfish, but oarfish swim vertically and move with a different rhythm. Others proposed a rare species of deep water shark with an unusual body shape. A few wondered if it could be a surviving specimen of a species thought extinct. None of the explanations fully matched what the footage showed. What unsettled the fishermen most was not the creature's appearance, but its behavior. It did not flee, it did not attack, it watched, circling slowly, staying just close enough for them to feel its awareness. Deliberate, almost purposeful, as if it were acknowledging the witnesses chosen to see it. It circled our boat 3 times, the captain said. Slow circles, like it was looking at us. Then it just dove straight down and disappeared. We stood there for 10 minutes, nobody said a word. What do you say after something like that? Hours before the creature appeared, residents along the coast had already sensed something wrong beneath the waves. Deep hums, rhythmic pulses, vibrations rising through the hulls of boats. These disturbances matched pressure anomalies recorded in seismic zones, hinting that whatever stirred the earth might also be stirring the sea. Some fishermen had turned back early that day, spooked by a feeling they couldn't name. Others had noticed their electronics flickering, fish finders showing strange readings, compasses drifting slightly off true north. The ocean was behaving differently, and then the creature appeared. When the footage spread online, public reaction divided sharply. Some claimed it was a biological rarity, a remnant of deep-sea evolution forced upward by geological shifts. Others saw the timing, the behavior, and the prophetic symbolism and concluded something different. This was not random, this was a sign. The Old Testament repeatedly links the sea to moments of divine revelation. Those crossing on the Red Sea, Jonah swallowed by the great fish, the Psalms declaring God's sovereignty over the deep. In that context, the creature's appearance felt less like an accident and more like a message. Job chapter 41 describes Leviathan, a creature of the deep whose might is so great that no one is fierce enough to rouse him, a being described not merely as part of creation, but as an instrument revealing God's power over the chaotic waters. Psalm 104 verse 26 speaks of Leviathan as one God formed to move through the deep at his command. Throughout Scripture, the sea represents more than water. It represents the unknown, the uncontrollable, the place where human power ends and something greater begins. And now, something from that place had surfaced. The creature's features matched no known species, but they echoed descriptions that had existed for thousands of years. The metallic skin, the dorsal spikes, the length and power, the deliberate movement. Those who knew Scripture could not help but see the parallels. Watching its head resembled something prehistoric but more sinister, one observer noted in a widely shared post. A row of jagged teeth curved outward like broken spears, each one reflecting light like polished steel. The description immediately drew comparisons to the biblical Leviathan, the mysterious sea creature described as one god formed to move through the deep at his command. The fishermen insisted the creature's behavior was unlike anything natural. It did not flee. It did not attack. It watched, circling slowly, remaining just close enough for them to feel its awareness. To many, this was the most unsettling aspect, its deliberate, almost purposeful movements, as if acknowledging the witnesses chosen to see it. And so the question that echoed throughout the nation carried a weight far beyond science. Did this being rise because of natural forces, or because the heavens allowed it? The creature had barely disappeared beneath the waves when the second sign arrived. This time not from the sea, but from the very earth beneath America's feet. Within just hours of the shocking footage, reports began pouring in from multiple U.S. coastlines. The ground was rising, shifting, breathing, as if something below was pushing upward. And what happened next would make the wildfires, the snowstorms, the drying rivers, and even the creature from the deep look like the beginning of something far larger than anyone had imagined. The creature had barely disappeared beneath the waves when the second sign arrived. This time not from the sea, but from the very earth beneath America's feet. Within just hours of the shocking footage, reports began pouring in from multiple U.S. coastlines. The ground was rising, shifting, breathing, as if something below was pushing upward. In Oregon, one homeowner noticed the tiles in her kitchen bend slightly upward, creating a soft arc that vanished the next morning. She stood staring at the floor for several minutes, unsure if she had imagined it. Then it happened again the following day. Same tiles, same arc, same silent bending. I called my husband and said, "Come look at this," she later told a local news crew. He thought I was crazy until he saw it himself. The floor just lifted. No noise, no shaking. Just this slow, gentle rise like something underneath was taking a breath. In Southern California, beachgoers felt a strange upward pressure under the sand, as though the shoreline were swelling like a lung. Children playing near the water's edge stopped and looked down at their feet. Parents pulled them back, uncertain what was happening beneath the surface. But the most alarming incident occurred along a quiet neighborhood near the Pacific coast, where the soil beneath several homes lifted just enough to tilt furniture and crack baseboards. Pictures fell from walls. Cabinet doors swung open on their own. A grandfather clock that had stood level for 30 years suddenly leaned against the wall as if drunk. These strange movements echoed a documented event in Bayview, San Francisco, where a resident's apartment floor rose nearly an inch, all without earthquakes, storms, or construction activity. That moment had baffled engineers. They had studied it, written reports, hypothesized about groundwater pressure and soil expansion. But now, with the same phenomenon appearing in multiple states, a pattern was emerging that could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Moisture levels inland surged unexpectedly. Sensors that once showed normal readings suddenly reported accelerating groundwater pressure, mimicking the very crisis unfolding in San Francisco. There, scientists had long warned that the massive seawall project built to protect the city was unintentionally forcing water upward through layers of weak soil. Now, similar symptoms were appearing hundreds of miles away. Dry regions felt damp, basements began sweating without explanation. Roads developed soft patches after weeks without rain. The ground itself seemed to be responding to something unseen. And then came the sideways shifts. Highway maintenance crews in Dogpatch had once recorded movements so subtle it seemed meaningless, only a few millimeters. But that was before multiple towns across America reported the same unsettling drift. Roads that veered slightly out of alignment, sidewalks that nudged against each other, painted lines that no longer matched their original paths, like a giant hand beneath the surface, pushing the land in slow, rhythmic pulses. When geologists overlaid the timing of these events with the creature's appearance offshore, the correlation was undeniable. Something deep within the earth was responding, something strong enough to distort foundations, redirect groundwater, and tilt entire structures. The ground was not cracking, it was not shaking. It was moving with a rhythm that felt almost biological, rise and fall, expand and contract, inhale and exhale. Pastors across the nation turned to Isaiah chapter 24, verse 19. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. What terrified people was not the shaking itself. After all, America is familiar with earthquakes. California experiences them regularly. Alaska has them constantly. The West Coast lives with seismic awareness as a fact of life. But this was different. This was not seismic, not natural in the way earthquakes are natural, not random. It felt intelligent. Whispers spread quickly across social media and prayer groups. Is the land reacting to the same unseen forces that drove the creature from the deep? Is something rising that humanity cannot yet see? Then the sinkholes began. In Florida, a family woke to find their backyard had collapsed into a crater 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep. The hole had opened silently during the night. No warning, no sound. Just the ground giving way beneath the surface while they slept. In California, a street split open during afternoon traffic, swallowing 2 cars before emergency crews could arrive. Witnesses said the asphalt simply sagged, then dropped, as if a trapdoor had been pulled from below. In Texas, a sinkhole tore through a residential neighborhood, forcing immediate evacuations. Residents described hearing a deep, low rumble, like something grinding far beneath them, minutes before the collapse. What makes these events especially disturbing is not just the damage, but the absence of an obvious cause. There were no major earthquakes shaking the region, no powerful storms tearing through beforehand, no single dramatic moment that could clearly explain why the earth suddenly gave way. Instead, the collapse arrived quietly, almost politely, as if the ground simply decided it could no longer hold. Experts pointed to years of silent underground erosion, water slowly dissolving limestone, soil being carried away grain by grain, cavities forming beneath streets and homes over decades, invisible to everyone above. The science was reasonable, the explanations made sense, but the timing did not. Sinkholes opening across multiple states simultaneously, the ground breathing in Oregon, California, and beyond, the creature rising offshore, the fires burning in the southeast, the snow falling in the Rockies, the rivers drying across the west. Each event individually could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern that felt less like coincidence and more like communication. For many believers, these moments brought to mind the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 21, verse 25. Upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. The verse describes a world where multiple systems, land, sea, nations, all experience instability at the same time. Not one crisis, not one disaster, but convergence, systems straining together. And perhaps that is what made this moment feel so different for so many people across the country. It no longer felt like one disaster here and another there. It felt as though the earth itself was groaning all at once. as if something long restrained was beginning to push against the surface. The ground beneath America was no longer holding. And if these signs were only the beginning, what would come next? Because even as families evacuated sinkhole zones and engineers studied the breathings soil, the sky was about to answer that question in a way no one expected. Trumpets were about to sound from above, and they were not coming from any instrument made by human hands. The ground was still settling from the sinkholes when the sound came. It began in the Midwest, a deep, resonant blast rolling across the sky with no visible source, no aircraft, no storm, no industrial equipment, just a sound that seemed to descend from above and vibrate through the air itself. Residents stepped outside their homes and looked up. Nothing was there, just open sky. But the sound continued, long, sustained, almost musical in its tone. A horn-like blast that echoed across the clouds and faded slowly into silence. It felt like the sky was speaking, one witness said. I know how that sounds, but I don't know how else to describe it. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Within hours, the same phenomenon erupted again, this time in Reno, Nevada. Commuters pulled over on the highway as the air itself seemed to vibrate. Some described the sound as ancient, others as mechanical, but all agreed it felt directed, as if the sky were issuing a warning. Then came Texas. In a town still recovering from devastating flash floods where unstable atmospheric pressure had triggered deadly surges of rainfall, residents heard the identical horn-like blast, echoing across the clouds. Many immediately drew parallels. The sound appeared during the same type of pressure shifts that had preceded the catastrophic flooding. Meteorologists reviewing early data noticed subtle distortions in upper atmospheric layers, ripples that did not match typical storm patterns. Something, it seemed, was pressing against the atmosphere from above or within. Something more than weather. Animals sensed it first. Cats arched their backs and bolted for shelter. Horses kicked against their stalls. Ranch dogs refused to leave their owners' sides, whining and pressing close to the ground. In some areas, birds launched from trees in frantic spirals, abandoning their usual evening flight patterns hours before sunset. Even elevators in downtown buildings slowed temporarily, their sensors momentarily confused by the subtle but detectable shift in environmental pressure. These were the same symptoms documented near California's geothermal fields, where human-induced seismicity had once produced faint but measurable distortions in the air and ground. But this time, there was no drilling, no seismic release, no machinery, only the sky and the sound. As recordings spread online, people played them again and again, each time with the same uneasy question: what are we actually hearing? Some described an overwhelming sense of presence during the blasts, as though unseen forces were moving just beyond the veil of the visible sky. Others felt dread, still others felt awe, but none could dismiss the collective instinct rising across the nation. These trumpets were not random. They were not accidental. They were not of human origin. Biblical scholars pointed immediately to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God. The verse, long studied as part of end-time prophecy, suddenly felt less symbolic and more literal. Across living rooms, churches, and classrooms, people played the recordings again and again, asking the same question: are these the sounds of nature, or the opening notes of something divine? Then the sky began to show what the trumpets had only announced. Over Utah, witnesses reported an unusual light formation appearing high above the landscape, not scattered or shifting, but forming a clear and unmistakable square. The shape did not stretch, blur, or drift with the wind. It remained precise, structured, and still, as if deliberately placed rather than naturally formed. What unsettled observers was not brightness alone, it was order. Light in nature is usually fluid. Clouds scatter it, storms bend it, weather distorts it. This was different. The edges appeared defined, the shape held. It did not pulse or flicker like lightning, nor glow like an aurora. It simply existed, suspended in the sky, commanding attention without movement or sound. Meteorologists and aviation systems offered no clear answers. There were no storm systems in the area at the time. Radar showed no aircraft activity that could account for the formation. No known weather phenomenon neatly explains a stationary geometric shape appearing and holding its form in open sky. Throughout history, shapes in the sky have carried meaning beyond spectacle. A square, in particular, is not associated with chaos or randomness. It represents measurement, boundaries, and order. It implies something being defined, assessed, or marked. In ancient understanding, to measure was to judge, not emotionally, but deliberately. To measure was to determine weight, value, and readiness. This is why the formation felt less like an event and more like a signal. It did not rush. It did not threaten. It did not entertain, it observed. The sky, often seen as distant and untouchable, appeared structured and intentional, as if attention itself was being focused downward. Then came the red sprite over Texas. It appeared above a violent thunderstorm, bursting upward and igniting a brief flash high in the mesosphere. On paper, it was physics, charge separation, atmospheric electricity, a measurable reaction to extreme weather. But most red sprites are faint and small. This one wasn't. Its scale was immense, its color deep and blood red, its shape tall, branching, almost column-like. It lingered in the imagination long after it faded. It appeared during a time already filled with tension and instability, and that timing alone made people pause. Not because science failed to explain it, but because meaning often depends on context. Joel chapter 2 verse 30 speaks of blood and fire, and columns of smoke appearing before a decisive moment in history. The language is ancient, poetic, symbolic. Yet when a red column of light rises above a storm-darkened Texas sky, the comparison becomes difficult to dismiss. The sprite burned nothing. It harmed no one. It left no damage behind. It simply appeared. Vast, silent, brilliant, and then disappeared as quickly as it came. That may be what makes it so unsettling. Not destruction, but interruption. A reminder that the heavens are not as still as we assume. Storms pass, skies clear, life resumes. But sometimes a brief flash above the clouds is enough to make people look up and ask whether the world is only reacting to physics, or whether now and then it is also reminding us who truly holds the sky. The red sign above Texas did not stand alone. Over the dark winter horizons of Alaska and Minnesota, the northern lights unfurled in a way few had seen before. Instead of scattered ribbons or shifting curtains, the aurora formed into a shape that appeared almost symmetrical. Two vast arcs of blue and violet light, stretching outward like wings suspended across the night. The glow curved gently at the edges, feathered in texture, hovering above frozen landscapes in complete silence as temperatures dropped. Across social media, the images spread with a single word repeated over and over: wings. The sky itself forming something that looked deliberate, something that looked like a sign. Jesus said in Luke chapter 21, verse 25, "There shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity." The verse does not point to one isolated sign, but many appearing together within the same period of time. Sun, moon, stars, earth, nations all converging. And perhaps that is what made this moment feel so different, because it no longer felt like one sign here and another there. It felt like the sky itself was joining the pattern, responding to the same unseen pulse that had stirred the sea and shaken the ground. But the sky was not finished speaking, because while America watched lights form squares and wings and blood-red columns above the clouds, another phenomenon was already gathering strength above the coastline. A massive black swarm of birds, twisting silently above the ocean, moving as one. And when the swarm appeared just before severe storms intensified along the coast, the timing would leave even skeptics searching for answers. The lights had barely faded from the sky when the swarms appeared. Near Monterey Bay, witnesses captured something that would spread across social media within hours. A massive black swarm of birds twisting silently above the ocean just before severe storms intensified along the coastline. Thousands moved together in dense, synchronized waves, suddenly shifting direction at the exact same moment as if reacting to something unseen beneath the skies and sea. From a distance, the swarm resembled a dark cloud or even a collapsing funnel hovering low above the water. Residents described the sight as eerie and unnatural. Some said the movement looked almost alive, like a giant shadow rolling across the ocean in complete silence. It didn't look real, one witness said, still staring at her phone footage days later. The way they moved, all of them at once, like they were connected to each other, like one mind controlling thousands of bodies. What disturbed many viewers most was not simply the birds themselves. It was the timing. Across America, wildfires were still burning. The ground was still breathing. Sinkholes were still opening. Creatures from the deep were still washing ashore. Trumpet sounds were still echoing across multiple states. Strange lights were still forming geometric shapes in the sky. And now this, a living shadow twisting above the sea. Scientists explain these formations as murmurations, a natural survival behavior commonly seen among starlings. The birds move together to confuse predators, share warmth, and communicate. The science was well documented. The mechanism was understood. And while that explanation was important, many people online remained unsettled by how unusual the scene appeared against the backdrop of growing disasters nationwide. Because the birds were not acting randomly. They were not scattered across the coastline in normal feeding patterns. They were gathered, dense, coordinated, moving with a precision that felt almost military. Hours after the swarm appeared, the storms arrived. Not gentle rain, not typical seasonal weather, but violent systems that tore across the coastline with winds that exceeded forecasts and lightning that struck in concentrations rarely recorded. The birds had gathered just before the worst of it, as if they knew what was coming before the meteorologists did. Animals sensing disaster before humans has scientific precedent. Elephants fleeing to high ground before the 2004 tsunami. Dogs behaving erratically before earthquakes. Birds abandoning nesting sites before severe weather events. The explanations exist. The mechanisms are studied, but the Monterey Bay swarm occurred within the same narrow window as everything else. The fires, the snow, the drying rivers, the hidden structures, the deep-sea creatures, the breathing ground, the trumpet sounds, the skylights. One event with an explanation is science. 10 events with explanations, all happening at once, begins to feel like something else entirely. For many believers, the images immediately brought scripture to mind. Luke chapter 21 verse 25 warns of distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Throughout the Bible, unusual movements in creation often appeared during moments of warning and uncertainty. But the swarms were not limited to California. Across other regions, reports emerged of insects appearing in unusual numbers. Not locusts in the biblical sense, but swarms large enough to draw attention. In some areas, butterflies migrating in patterns that didn't match seasonal norms. In others, bees abandoning hives for reasons scientists struggled to explain. And then there were the birds dying. In several states, residents reported finding dead birds scattered across neighborhoods. Not the occasional single bird, but clusters, dozens in a single area. Species that should have been healthy dropping from the sky without obvious cause. Wildlife officials pointed to disease, environmental stress, and habitat disruption. But the images added another layer to the growing sense of unease. Joel chapter 1 warns of failing vegetation, dying animals, and a land under pressure. The language is ancient, but watching swarms twist above the ocean while dead birds appeared in neighborhoods across multiple states, the ancient words no longer felt distant. What made the swarms psychologically significant was not their scale, but their symbolism. Throughout Scripture, swarms often represented judgment or warning. The plagues of Egypt included swarms of locusts and flies. Revelation describes creatures emerging in numbers that darken the sky. The Bible uses creation itself as a messenger. When animals behave strangely, it often signals that something larger is shifting. And now, across America, creation was behaving strangely everywhere. The birds above Monterey Bay, the deep-sea creatures washing ashore, the trees dying overnight in California forests, the ground itself breathing and collapsing. Every layer of creation, land, sea, sky, and living things, seemed to be responding to the same unseen pressure. As the storms intensified along the coast and the swarms continued their silent dance above the water, many Americans found themselves asking the same unsettling question. Are these simply natural events happening to occur at the same time? Or are we watching something converge that was described in Scripture thousands of years ago? Because even as the swarms twisted above the Pacific and the storms hammered the coastline, yet another crisis was already unfolding that would make the previous signs look like warnings rather than the main event. In Texas and Oklahoma, the sky was about to turn a color no one had seen before. And beneath that unnatural sky, tornadoes were forming with a violence that even experienced storm chasers said they had never witnessed. Texas is no stranger to violent storms. The state has seen tornadoes tear through small towns, hurricanes slam the Gulf Coast, and hailstones large enough to shatter windshields. But what unfolded across Texas and Oklahoma during this same narrow window of time was different, not just in intensity, but in appearance. The sky changed color. Not the pale green that sometimes precedes severe weather. Not the bruised purple of a summer thunderstorm. This was something else entirely. Witnesses described it as yellow-green, almost fluorescent, spreading across the horizon like a stain, then deepening into shades of amber and burnt orange that seemed to pulse rather than simply sit. It looked like the sky was sick, one resident said, standing in her driveway with her phone pointed upward. I've lived in Texas my whole life. I've seen tornado skies. This wasn't that. This was something I've never seen before. Then the tornadoes came. Not one or two. Multiple funnels dropping from the same storm system. Some visible simultaneously from the same vantage point. Storm chasers who had tracked tornadoes for decades said the behavior was unusual. The funnels didn't follow predictable paths. They shifted, looped back. Some seemed to dissipate and reform within minutes. In Oklahoma, one tornado touched down in a rural area and carved a path nearly 2 miles wide, far larger than the typical funnel. The width alone made it impossible to outrun. Residents who had sheltered from tornadoes before said this one sounded different. Not the freight train roar they expected. Something deeper, a rumble they could feel in their bones. Meteorologists tracked the systems using every tool available: Doppler radar, satellite imagery, spotter networks on the ground. The data showed atmospheric conditions that were, in technical terms, off the charts, instability indices that forecasters rarely saw, wind shear profiles that created perfect conditions for long-lived, violent tornadoes. The science was clear, the ingredients were present, the mechanisms were understood. But what unsettled many was not the tornadoes themselves, it was the sky that surrounded them. Between the funnels, witnesses reported seeing colors in the clouds that didn't belong, streaks of red and violet that appeared briefly and vanished. Some said the clouds themselves seemed to glow from within, as if lit by a source other than the sun. Others described a darkness that fell too quickly, like a curtain being drawn across the sky in the middle of the afternoon. One storm chaser broadcasting live to thousands of viewers paused mid-sentence and said, "I don't know what I'm looking at right now. The color on this storm, this isn't normal. I've chased 300 tornadoes. I've never seen the sky do this." His feed cut out moments later as the storm intensified. In several communities, the tornadoes were accompanied by hail, unlike anything residents had experienced. Not the typical pellets that dent cars and strip leaves from trees. These were chunks of ice the size of softballs, some larger. They punched through roofs. They shattered windows. They left craters in the ground where they landed. The hail fell with such force that it was mistaken for explosions. Emergency calls flooded in from neighborhoods where the ice had torn through ceilings and injured people sheltering in their own homes. Then the rain came. Not the steady downpour that follows most storms. This was a deluge so intense that visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. Flash floods swept through areas that had never flooded before. Cars were carried away. Roads became rivers. In one Oklahoma town, the water rose so fast that families had to climb onto their roofs to escape it. The same roofs that had just been pummeled by hail. The storm was attacking from every direction at once. What made this sequence especially terrifying was how it mirrored the pattern already established. First came the unnatural sky, then the wind, then the hail, then the flood, layer upon layer, each one exploiting the damage done by the one before. For many believers, the progression felt uncomfortably familiar. Luke chapter 21 describes signs in the heavens, distress of nations, and perplexity. The verse does not list isolated incidents. It paints a picture of overwhelming convergence. Multiple crises arriving together until the human mind struggles to process them all. That is exactly what was happening across Texas and Oklahoma. People were not simply afraid of one storm, they were exhausted by the sequence: fire, snow, flood, sinkhole, creature, trumpet, swarm, and now this. A sky that looked wrong and tornadoes that behaved strangely and hail that fell like weapons. The psychological toll was becoming its own kind of disaster. Pastors in affected areas reported a surge in prayer gatherings. Not the scheduled Sunday services, but impromptu meetings where people came together simply because they needed to be with others who believed. They needed to hear that this was not random, that there was meaning behind the chaos. One pastor in Oklahoma City said, "I've had more people walk through my doors this week than in the last 6 months combined. They're not asking about theology. They're asking one question: is this what the Bible warned us about?" The question echoed across social media. Videos of the colored skies went viral. The footage was shared alongside verses from Joel, Matthew, Luke, and Revelation. For every scientific explanation offered, there were thousands of comments pointing toward prophecy. What made the moment so powerful was not the scale of destruction. Other tornado outbreaks had caused more damage. Other hailstorms had been more costly. What made this different was the convergence. The sky did not simply produce a storm. It produced a spectacle, a display that seemed designed to make people look up and ask questions. And those questions were about to become even more urgent. Because while Texas and Oklahoma were still reeling from the tornadoes and the strange skies, another disaster was already unfolding elsewhere. A massive bridge had collapsed without warning, and the images of concrete and steel crumbling into the water below would become one of the most shared moments of the entire crisis. Not because of the damage, but because of what the collapse represented. Something America had trusted was about to fail. The sky had only just cleared over Texas when another kind of disaster struck. Without warning, a massive bridge collapsed. In seconds, huge concrete sections that had stood for decades crashed into the water below as witnesses watched in disbelief. What had been a symbol of connection and stability was reduced to twisted debris and clouds of dust within moments. Drivers nearby said the structure appeared normal only minutes earlier. There was no earthquake, no storm, no collision, nothing that should have caused a failure of that scale. One moment the bridge stood as it had for generations. The next it simply came apart. It just fell, one witness said, his voice shaking. There was no warning, no sound before it happened, just a crack, and then everything dropped. I saw cars, I saw people. I can't get it out of my head. The images spread rapidly. Concrete slabs the size of rooms tilted at impossible angles. Vehicles crushed beneath debris. Emergency crews racing against time to reach anyone who might have survived. Helicopters circling overhead. The familiar routine of American disaster response. But what made this collapse resonate so deeply was not just the destruction. It was the symbolism. A bridge is more than infrastructure. It represents connection, trust, the belief that what we build will hold. People cross bridges every day without a second thought, assuming the engineering is sound and the foundations are secure. Until one day, they aren't. For many viewers, the disaster became more than just a news headline. It reflected a growing feeling across the country that things once considered stable no longer feel guaranteed. Fires were spreading across multiple states, rivers were drying, seasons felt unpredictable, the ground was breathing and collapsing, the sky was turning strange colors. And now even major structures people trusted every day seemed more fragile than before. The collapse did not happen in isolation. It occurred within the same timeline that brought fires to the southeast, snow to the Rockies, sinkholes to Florida and California, and trumpet sounds across the Midwest. Each event alone might have been manageable. Together, they were overwhelming the national sense of security. Engineers immediately began investigating the cause. They pointed to aging infrastructure, years of deferred maintenance, stress fractures that had gone undetected during routine inspections. The bridge had been rated as structurally deficient in earlier reports, a classification shared by thousands of bridges across the United States. The science was clear. The warning signs had been there. The data had been recorded. The reports had been filed. And yet, nothing had been done in time. That was the part that haunted people. Not that the bridge had failed without warning, but that the warning had been given and ignored. Some believers were reminded of Matthew chapter 7, verses 26 and 27, where Jesus warned about foundations that appear strong outwardly, but cannot endure pressure when storms come. He told of a man who built his house upon sand. The rains fell. The floods came. The winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Throughout Scripture, strong foundations represented wisdom, stability, and trust placed in something lasting. Weak foundations represented neglect, complacency, and misplaced confidence. The bridge had looked strong from the outside. Cars had crossed it safely for decades. Commuters had driven over it without a second thought. But beneath the visible surface, things were breaking down, slowly, quietly, until the pressure became too great. And perhaps that is why this moment affected so many people emotionally. Because beyond the collapse itself was a deeper realization many could not ignore. How quickly stability can disappear when people least expect it. How many other things in American life looked strong on the outside while quietly deteriorating within? The bridge collapse was not just a local tragedy, it became a metaphor. A warning written in concrete and steel that echoed the warnings written in fire and flood and sinking ground. Something foundational was failing, not just in infrastructure, but in the deeper structures of trust and security that held the nation together. Across social media, the footage was shared alongside verses and prayers. Some called it a sign. Others simply called it heartbreaking. But nearly everyone felt the same unease. If a bridge could fall without warning, what else might be about to break? And just as Americans were still absorbing the images from the bridge collapse, another unsettling phenomenon was beginning to draw attention from across California. Healthy trees that had stood for decades suddenly turned dry and lifeless almost overnight. Entire sections of forest looked abandoned and gray within days. No fire. No drought visible in the immediate area. Just death spreading through the landscape without explanation. The land itself seemed to be failing from within. And what scientists would discover about the dying trees would raise questions even they struggled to answer. The bridge collapse was still dominating headlines when another unsettling phenomenon began drawing attention from across California. Healthy trees that had stood for decades suddenly turned dry and lifeless almost overnight. Entire sections of forest looked abandoned and gray within days. No fire had touched them. No drought was visible in the immediate area. No obvious cause that could explain why life was draining from the landscape so quickly. Residents described driving through areas that were once green and full of life, only to find large clusters of trees completely changed without warning. Forests they had known since childhood looked like photographs faded by time. The green was gone. The leaves were brittle. The bark was cracking. I drove this road 2 weeks ago and everything was fine, one woman said, standing at the edge of a grove of dead oaks. Now look at it. They're all dead, not dying. Dead, what does that? What kills trees in 2 weeks? What made the situation even stranger was how selective it appeared. Some trees stood dead and brittle, their leaves brown and curled. Others only a few feet away remained healthy and untouched. The pattern didn't follow any logic visible to the naked eye. No line of disease spreading outward. No path of contamination, just death choosing some trees and sparing others. Many locals said the suddenness felt deeply disturbing, as if life had simply disappeared from the land without explanation. One day the forests appeared alive. The next, entire sections stood silent and lifeless beneath the California sky. Scientists continued examining possible causes. Drought stress accumulated over years. Disease pathogens that spread through root systems. Changing soil conditions that starved trees of nutrients. Insect infestations that attacked weakened specimens. Each explanation carried weight. Each one made scientific sense. Yet even the researchers admitted that the speed of the decline was unusual. Trees that had survived previous droughts, previous heat waves, previous pest invasions were suddenly giving up all at once. Something had pushed them past their threshold, and it had happened now. During the same season as the fires, the snow, the sinkholes, the dying rivers, the deep-sea creatures, the trumpet sounds, the strange skies, the bridge collapse. The convergence was becoming impossible to ignore. For many people living nearby, the emotional impact went beyond science alone. It was the speed of the change that continued to unsettle them. Not a gradual decline over years, not the slow creep of climate shift, but death arriving almost overnight. I've been hiking these trails for 30 years, one man said, standing among the gray branches of a forest he had known intimately. These trees were alive last month. I touched them. I took pictures under them. Now they're just standing there dead. It feels wrong. The whole forest feels wrong. As images spread online, many believers began reflecting on scripture connected to the condition of the land itself. Joel chapter 1 verse 12 warns, "All the trees of the field are withered." The verse appears in a passage describing a land under judgment, a place where creation itself responds to spiritual conditions. Throughout the Bible, failing vegetation often symbolized seasons of instability, warning, and spiritual distance. When the prophets described judgment, they frequently included images of dying trees, failing crops, and land that could no longer sustain life. The land was understood to reflect something deeper, not just weather, not just soil chemistry, but a connection between creation and its creator. Romans chapter 8 verse 22 says creation groans, waiting, straining like something in labor. And perhaps that is why these scenes were affecting so many people across the country. Because alongside the fires, collapsing structures, drying rivers, and strange skies, even nature itself now seemed to be changing in ways many Americans said they no longer recognized. The trees were not the only vegetation suffering. Reports emerged from agricultural regions of crops failing without clear explanation. Orchards that had produced fruit for generations suddenly yielding shriveled harvests. Vineyards watching vines wither before the grapes could mature. Farmers who had worked the land for decades said they had never seen anything like it. Not a single bad year which they understood and expected, but a pattern of decline that seemed to accelerate with each passing season. "You can't fight what you can't see," one farmer in Central California said, running his hand along a dead branch. "I know how to fight drought. I know how to fight pests. I don't know how to fight this. The land just feels tired, like it's giving up." Those words echoed across regions and industries. The land feels tired, like it's giving up. Scripture describes moments when the land itself mourns. Hosea chapter 4 verse 3 says, "Therefore shall the land mourn, and everyone that dwelleth therein shall languish, with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven. Yea, the fishes of the sea also shall be taken away." The verse connects the condition of the land to the condition of the people on it, not as punishment alone, but as consequence. A relationship between human choices and creation's response. When the moral fabric frays, the physical fabric follows. Now across California, trees were dying overnight. Creatures were washing ashore from the deep. The ground was breathing and collapsing. Fires were burning where they had never burned. The sky was forming shapes and sounding warning. And many were beginning to ask whether these signs were connected, not just by weather patterns or geological activity, but by something deeper, something that transcended scientific explanation. Because even as the trees continued dying and the forests turned gray, reports were already emerging from the mountains that would make everything before look like the opening act. Deep beneath the Appalachians, after a small earthquake in a remote area, something had been discovered, a hidden chamber, sealed beneath the earth, containing markings no one could immediately identify. And like the structures in Lake Mead, the oarfish on the beaches, and the creature from the deep, this chamber had been hidden for a very long time. It was no longer hidden now. The trees were still dying across California when the earth beneath Appalachia opened a door no one knew existed. After a small earthquake in a remote area, witnesses said a narrow opening became visible along a rocky hillside, a crack in the earth that had not been there before. It revealed what appeared to be a hidden underground chamber sealed beneath the ground for what looked like centuries. The earthquake itself was minor, barely enough to register on instruments, not the kind of seismic event that typically changes landscapes or exposes hidden formations. But when the shaking stopped, something had shifted. The hillside was no longer solid. It had opened just enough to reveal what lay beneath. People who entered the space described an eerie silence unlike anything they had experienced before, the kind of silence that feels heavy, old, like the air itself had been undisturbed for millennia and resented the intrusion. Some claimed strange markings covered sections of the walls, not random scratches or natural mineral deposits, but patterns that appeared intentional, lines that intersected at angles, shapes that repeated in sequences, symbols that did not match any known Native American script from the region or any colonial markings. The walls weren't natural, one person who entered the chamber said. You could see tool marks. Someone made this place, someone sealed it, and we were the first people to see it in a very long time. Images and videos spreading online quickly fueled speculation. Some viewers questioned how such a place could remain hidden for so long. Others focused on the markings, comparing them to known archaeological sites and finding no clear matches. Still, others simply felt the unease of watching something ancient emerge into the modern world without explanation. What disturbed many people most was not only the chamber itself, it was the timing. Across America, rivers were uncovering hidden structures. Sinkholes were opening without warning, revealing cavities that had formed over decades. The deep sea was releasing creatures that belonged in darkness. And now, another sealed space had reportedly appeared beneath the mountains. To many observers, it felt as if buried things were no longer staying buried. Scientists and researchers urged caution, noting that underground formations and caves can naturally emerge after seismic activity. Earthquakes shift the ground, hillsides crack open, cavities that were once sealed become exposed. The process is well documented and understood. But even with those explanations, the mystery surrounding the chamber continued to grow across social media, because the discovery was not happening in isolation. It was happening during a season already crowded with signs: the fires, the snowstorms, the drying rivers, the deep-sea creatures, the breathing ground, the trumpet sounds, the strange skies, the swarms, the bridge collapse, the dying trees. And now, a hidden chamber opening beneath the mountains. The convergence was no longer subtle. It was loud. For many believers, the reports immediately brought scripture to mind. Daniel chapter 12 verse 4 speaks of things remaining sealed until the time of the end. The verse describes knowledge being hidden, information being preserved, secrets waiting for their appointed moment to be revealed. Shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end, the verse reads. It suggests that some things are meant to remain hidden, until they aren't. A verse some Christians connect to hidden places suddenly being revealed during periods of instability and change, not as accidents, not as coincidences, but as part of a divine timeline where what was concealed must eventually come to light. And perhaps that is why discoveries like this were affecting people so deeply, because alongside the fires, strange skies, collapsing structures, and environmental shifts, many Americans now felt that something hidden beneath the surface of the nation was slowly beginning to emerge into the light. The chamber in the Appalachians was not the only discovery. Similar reports surfaced from other regions. A cave in Big Bend, Texas, revealed ancient hunting tools, spearheads, and wet stones nearly 7,000 years old that had remained sealed in darkness for millennia. Several pieces carried unusual geometric carvings that did not fully match known local civilizations. In the Southwest, petroglyphs exposed by receding water revealed symbols that archaeologists were still working to interpret. Along the East Coast, erosion revealed old foundations that predated known settlement records. In each case, the pattern was the same: something hidden, something revealed, something that forced questions about what else might be waiting beneath the surface. Luke chapter 8 verse 17 says, "For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad." The verse does not limit itself to spiritual truth alone. It describes a principle of revelation. What is hidden will be shown. What is buried will be uncovered. What is sealed will be opened. And across America, that principle seemed to be unfolding in real time. The hidden chamber in the Appalachians did not come with an instruction manual. No ancient scrolls explained its purpose. No inscription announced its meaning. It simply opened, silently, without explanation, as if waiting for someone to understand. That is often how revelation works. Not with clarity, but with questions. Not with answers, but with a sudden awareness that there is more happening than previously known. And as the images of the chamber continued spreading online, the same question echoed across platforms and conversations. What else is buried that hasn't surfaced yet? What other secrets are waiting beneath the ground, the water, and the mountains? Because while attention was focused on the hidden chamber in Appalachia, something even stranger was about to draw eyes upward again. This time, not to the sky for lights or sounds, but to something moving through the air with a precision that no weather pattern, no aircraft, and no natural phenomenon could explain. Dark objects suspended in the sky, motionless despite strong winds moving around them. And they were not alone. The hidden chamber beneath Appalachia was still dominating conversation when attention turned upward once more. Across several regions in the United States, witnesses reported seeing dark objects suspended motionless in the air despite strong winds moving around them. Not drifting, not swaying, not responding to the weather in any visible way. Just fixed in place, as if anchored to something invisible. Videos of the sightings spread quickly online because many viewers said the formations did not appear random. Some shapes looked geometric or symbol-like, remaining fixed in position before suddenly shifting together and disappearing without explanation. Others described the movements as strangely controlled, almost as if the objects were responding to one another in perfect coordination. One witness in the Midwest stood in his backyard and filmed 3 dark shapes arranged in a triangle formation. They remained still for nearly 4 minutes, while clouds moved rapidly behind them. Then, without any visible signal, all 3 shifted simultaneously and vanished. It wasn't like they flew away, he said. They just weren't there anymore. One frame they were there, the next frame empty sky. I've never seen anything move like that. What unsettled people most was not fear alone. It was the feeling that something about the sky no longer looked normal. Witnesses described moments of silence and confusion as they watched the dark formations remain steady while clouds and wind continued moving around them. In several clips, the objects seemed to vanish almost instantly, leaving viewers searching for explanations. The footage generated intense debate online. Some viewers pointed to drones, noting that modern quadsters can hover with precision and move in coordinated patterns. Others suggested atmospheric distortions, temperature inversions, or ice crystals, creating visual effects that looked solid but weren't. A few proposed military aircraft or experimental technology being tested. Experts urged caution, noting that unusual atmospheric conditions, distant birds, drones, or optical distortions can sometimes create confusing visual effects. The human eye is easily tricked. Cameras add another layer of potential distortion. What looks like a solid dark object might be a shadow, a reflection, or a trick of perspective. And Scripture itself warns against rushing toward conclusions or fear when interpreting strange events. But even with those cautions, the sightings continued. Not in one place, but in many. Not on one day, but across weeks. Different witnesses in different states describing similar phenomena. Dark shapes, motionless against the wind, then gone. For many believers, the images immediately brought to mind Luke chapter 21, verse 25, which speaks of signs appearing in the heavens during times of growing distress and uncertainty upon the earth. The verse does not describe one specific sign, but a category of events. Signs in the sun, signs in the moon, signs in the stars. The heavens themselves becoming a canvas for something beyond normal experience. Throughout Scripture, unusual activity in the sky often caused people to stop, reflect, and question what was happening around them. The Star of Bethlehem guided wise men to a king. The darkness at the crucifixion made centurions tremble. The pillar of cloud and fire led Israel through the wilderness. The heavens were never just background, they were messengers. And now, across America, the sky seemed to be sending messages no one could fully decode. What made the dark objects especially unsettling was their apparent intelligence. They were not random, not scattered. They positioned themselves in patterns. They held formation against winds that should have dispersed any natural phenomenon. They moved together at moments that seemed coordinated, I've seen drones, one witness said. I know what drones look like. These weren't drones. Drones don't vanish. Drones don't sit perfectly still in 30-mile-an-hour winds. Whatever these were, they weren't something I can explain. His frustration captured the larger mood. People were not necessarily afraid. They were confused. And confusion, when layered on top of fire and flood and collapsing bridges and dying forests, becomes its own kind of weight. The dark objects did not threaten anyone. They did not cause damage. They simply appeared, silent, fixed, deliberate, and then disappeared. But in their appearing, they added another layer to the growing sense that the normal boundaries of experience were shifting. The sky, which had always been the most predictable part of creation, now seemed as unstable as the ground and the sea. And perhaps that was the point. Because throughout Scripture, when the heavens joined the pattern, it signified that something significant was approaching. Not just earthly trouble, not just natural disaster, but a moment of divine attention. A time when the veil between the physical and spiritual grew thin. Revelation chapter 6 describes the sky receding like a scroll, the sun turning black, the moon becoming like blood, the stars falling. These are not subtle signs, they are unmistakable. They demand attention. The dark objects hovering across America were not that, not yet. But for many watching, they felt like a preview, a small sample of what might come, a hint that the heavens were not as distant as they seemed. And as the sightings continued and the footage spread and the debates raged online, many Americans found themselves looking up more often, watching the sky, waiting, because the pattern had become clear. The land was groaning. The sea was releasing its dead. The ground was breathing and collapsing. The sky was forming shapes and sounding trumpets. And now, the heavens themselves were drawing attention. If these were signs, they were not arriving one at a time anymore. They were coming together, converging, overlapping. And the question no one could answer was not whether more signs would come. It was what they were pointing toward. Because even as the dark objects continued appearing above American skies, something far more disturbing was already stirring beneath the surface of another part of the country. In the volcanic fields of California, sensors were detecting activity that had not been seen in thousands of years. And what happened next would force even the skeptics to ask whether the Earth itself was preparing for something none of the models had predicted. The dark objects had faded from the sky. The trumpet sounds had fallen silent. The fire still burned in places, but the headlines were moving on. And yet, across America, something had shifted that could not be measured by instruments or captured on video. A question had been planted, not about one disaster or one strange event, but about the pattern itself, the convergence, the timing, the way the land, the sea, the sky, and the heavens had all seemed to speak at once. Was this just environmental chaos? A bad season of weather and coincidence amplified by social media? Scientists would say yes. They would point to climate patterns, geological cycles, and the human tendency to find meaning in random events. They would be right about the mechanisms. They would be accurate about the data. But mechanisms and data cannot answer the deeper question. Why now? Why together? Why with such precision that witnesses in different states, watching different events, all described the same feeling, that something had shifted, that the world they knew was becoming something else. Jesus said it would be like birth pains, not random, not scattered, but increasing, closer together, more intense, until the moment arrives. Matthew 24, verse 8, all these are the beginning of sorrows. The word in Greek is Odin. Birth pains, labor contractions, they start far apart, mild, easy to dismiss, then they intensify. They come faster, they last longer. And when they are close enough together, everyone in the room knows the moment is near. What if the fires, the floods, the sinkholes, the dying trees, the strange skies, and the trumpet sounds were not separate events at all? What if they were contractions in a sequence that has been building for a long time? The sea gave up what it held. The ground breathed and collapsed. The rivers dried and exposed secrets. The sky turned colors no one could explain. The heavens drew attention with lights and sounds and dark shapes that defied easy answers. Each one could be explained. But together, they formed something that explanations could not contain. And the hidden things kept surfacing. That was the detail that lingered. The structures beneath Lake Mead, the chamber in Appalachia, the petroglyphs revealed by receding water, the deep sea creatures washing ashore alive, the ancient tools in the Texas cave, things that had been buried for generations, centuries, millennia, suddenly visible, suddenly revealed. Luke 8:17 says, nothing hidden will fail to be disclosed. Nothing concealed will fail to be brought into the light. If that verse is true, then the revealing is not random. It follows a purpose. It obeys a timeline. And what is surfacing now may only be the beginning. Across the country, more people are openly discussing Bible prophecy than at any time in recent memory. Not just in churches, not just in prayer groups, but in comment sections, social media posts, and conversations between strangers who sense that something has changed. They are asking whether the events happening around the world resemble what scriptures described thousands of years ago. They are asking whether the birth pains are accelerating. They are asking how much time remains. Scripture does not answer that question with a date. It answers with a posture. Watch, be ready, stay awake. Jesus told his followers not to panic when these things began to happen. He told them to look up, to recognize the season, to understand that the approaching storm was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something greater. And yet, the warning was clear. Many would be caught off guard. Not because the signs were absent, but because they were ignored. Life would continue. People would eat and drink and marry and work, and then the moment would arrive, and many would not be ready. The purpose of recognizing signs is not to create fear, it is to awaken faithfulness. Because in the end, the greatest question is no longer what is happening in the world. It is whether people are spiritually prepared for what may come next. The fires will burn. The floods will rise. The ground will shift. The sky will speak. These are not punishments. They are announcements. Reminders that the world is fragile, that stability is conditional, that what can be shaken will be shaken, so that what cannot be shaken may remain, and what remains. According to Scripture, only one thing: the kingdom that cannot be moved, the king who cannot be defeated, the promise that cannot be broken. The signs are not the destination, they are signposts, pointing towards something, someone, greater than the chaos. The question is whether anyone is paying attention, because the sequence is not finished. The dark objects have not stopped appearing, the trumpet sounds have not stopped echoing, the ground has not stopped breathing, and across the volcanic fields of California, sensors continue detecting activity that scientists cannot fully explain. Tremors at depths that suggest something is stirring far beneath the surface. If these are birth pains, they are still increasing, and the next one is already forming.